I started checking these boxes, clean and sober, graduated, bought a house, and
And these are all things that probably when you were in the street seemed so hard to get.
oh, it wasn't even a reality. It was more, that was a fairy tale. I was never going to be able to buy a house or, be able to,
Have a job that,
a good paying
go to
job.
college, all
Yeah.
those
Yeah. I
things.
never thought about that. I want people to know that they can overcome, whether it's drugs, lust, pornography, gambling,
All of it.
all of it. You can overcome all of it.
Mhm.
And the joy and happiness that I have in my life is just so profound because I want everybody to have it, and I know that they can.
I think in a way going to prison, it's like it separates you.
Oh my goodness.
And all of a sudden you have a clearer vision.
Yes.
And so I was really grateful for that because I was like, oh, I've been tricked.
Yep.
I was out there in the world thinking that money and success and all that mattered. And when all of it's gone, I could see that I had given all my power away. Welcome to the Living Louder podcast. Today, I will be visiting with a dear friend, somebody that has come back from things that not a lot of people come back from, but he has a powerful testimony and a powerful story. So, my friend Michael Germaine Mansfield, we met a few years ago, and now he's living in Minnesota, which is where I did some of my prison time, and he's out here to visit. And so, we're going to have a conversation about life experiences. Both of us spent time in prison and how that shaped our lives and the way our view has become different. We're both members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yes.
Love to visit with you. We talk all the time.
Yep.
So, but it's pretty cool that we could be able to share our stories in a more public way.
Absolutely. I just want to say it's an honor to be here, and it's a great way to start 2026.
Yeah.
Yes. Great way to start the new year. So
Yeah.
just grateful to be here, grateful for our relationship, and grateful to be able to learn and to grow and to be able to speak my truth,
Yeah.
and I'm grateful for this platform and love watching everything that you're doing, and just grateful to be here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I want to give people some history, your story. I think the comeback from the hard things is really powerful, but also as as a mother, sometimes I think, okay, my kids, when they're stuck in the middle, I don't realize how maybe their younger years, even though they were hard, were contributing to their future, and how, like in the thick of things, parents can maybe see some hope that the values they instilled in their kids at a young age do have an impact.
Mhm.
So, would you share kind of what your younger years were like, obviously, and then the hard stuff, and then we'll talk about the
Yeah.
comeback.
So I had some really great spiritual teachings as a child. My father was part of something called the I am activity. And I'm just going to read a little bit and elaborate a little bit about the teachings my father kind of instilled in me as a child. And it's called the I am activity. And I just want to read a little bit with you guys. So the I am activity of the Saint Germain Foundation. The I am extended master instruction is the true education of life, a spiritual illumination of the people. It is brought forth in the interest of the public good. This understanding of the great creative word of life, I am, is the great God power which has created this planet and the eternal law of life. It is the balance between religion and education. When one is educated in the extended master's truth of the I am, he or she knows that to worship perfection is the highest education of life. The truth of life is that all the universe there is but one God, the I am, God in action, and that every person on earth has the individualized flame of God anchored within his or her heart. And that just, that just, it's all about the God that's within us, and we have a great, loving, eternal, Father that loves us, and he's with us all the way,
And so this is your father and mother both were kind of in these spiritual kind of, I guess I would say, seeking.
Yeah,
They were seeking.
for sure. And I'm going to just elaborate a little bit more about this on my father's side and then on my mother's side, what she was involved in. And so the purpose of the Extended Master's I Am activity is to give help from their octave of life. Mankind must have their help at this time against the onrush of the world's destruction, because no outer activity in the world can solve the world's problems, nor stop the destruction which human beings are releasing against each other. The goal is to protect all that is constructive in the world, to maintain God ideals by worshiping God in the highest, most powerful way possible, and to bring forth the fulfillment of God's plan for America
Hmm.
and all God-loving nations of the world.
Hmm.
Um,
So this is called the Saint Germain Foundation, and your father actually named you after
yeah, that's
your
my middle name is Saint Germain, and just a little bit about Saint Germain. The Extended Master Saint Germain is one of those great beings from the spiritual hierarchy who help govern this planet. The Extended Masters, who are beings who are wholly divine, for they have made the ascension as beloved Jesus did. They are the elder brothers and teachers of mankind on the earth. Having lived through human experience, they have, by their own self-effort of love of God, become wholly perfected and wield power without limit. They labor ceaselessly to consume the discord generated on earth and give assistance without limit to all that will call unto them for help and make a self-conscious effort to serve the constructive way of life. And there's many extended masters, and a lot of biblical extended masters were Moses, Melchizedek, Enoch, Paul, Elijah, and most of all, Jesus.
So you were taught these things as a kid, but you kind of got lost in your teenage
I would
years.
say it was more, my dad would talk about it, and I would just kind of listen to him. But I think most of it he instilled in me subconsciously the way I watched him live his life. He'd always be reading out of the Saint Germain, highlighting and underlining things. And so I really just feel that the way he treated me, the way he raised me,
He was the example of these principles.
exactly the example, And so my father, Melvin Lee Mansfield, was my master teacher. And at the time, I didn't really focus too much attention on it. I was a kid, but subconsciously it really got instilled into my heart of these teachings and how important they are to me today. And that was kind of on my father's side, the spiritual experiences I had on my father's side.
Okay. And your parents were divorced when you were young, right?
Yes.
So you went back and forth. And
Yes.
what was that like for you? And your mom had a different kind of a path, right?
Yeah. So she followed something called the Ramtha School of Enlightenment, and you know, um, at about 11 or 12 is when I went to the Ramtha School, just for a couple years. It was like they were called like a retreat.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to like maybe 2 or 3 retreats. And growing up, it was kind of embarrassing to me because the town that I lived in, everybody called anyone who was in the Ramtha school like a Ramster or a cult member. And so, but at the Ramtha school, I had some pretty remarkable teachings that are kind of hard to understand. But at the time, I didn't really understand the point of it, but now I really do.
Mm.
And some of the things that we do is one of the things. It's a labyrinth. It's a big maze. I don't know, maybe a half acre or acre. And the point of it is to get to the middle, which is the tree of life. But the what's interesting about it is you have to put blindfolds on, and they
Mm-hmm.
tape these blindfolds onto your face, and you start maybe a couple hundred yards away in this big open field. And the objective is to get to the center of this maze or labyrinth. It was called the tank.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about focus.
Okay.
And what's interesting is the first time I ever went to the labyrinth or the tank, guess what I did? I made it to the center, which is called the void,
Mm-hmm.
to the tree of life.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to just read a little bit about these teachings and how later on in my story, how it kind of can correlate to how they played an impact in my life.
Okay.
Um,
I really love that you are able to take the things that you learned as a young child, even though things got completely crazy for you, and you come back to it. I
yeah,
think that.
for sure. So the purpose of being blindfolded in the labyrinth, and this is GPT,
Mhm.
turning off the outer senses. The blindfold removes sight, which the Ramtha teaches is a dominant sense that keeps people dependent on the external world. By removing vision, students are encouraged to rely on the inner awareness, intuition, and feeling rather than the logic or habit. Training the mind to lead the body. Ramtha emphasizes that the mind should not command the body, not to react to it. Or no, Ramtha emphasizes that the mind should command the body, not react to it. Walking the labyrinth blindfolded is meant to train, focus, calmness, and trust in one's intuition. Confronting fear and uncertainty. Being blindfolded naturally produces anxiety, distortion. This exercise is intended to help participants recognize fear as a mental construct and move through consciously. And the fourth thing, symbol of journey of consciousness. The labyrinth represents the path of life or enlightenment, not a straight line, but a winding one. Blindfolded movement symbolizes walking life without certainty while learning to remain present and sovereign. And in my life, throughout all the addictions, the 20 years of addictions, it's like being blind,
Yeah.
and what's the goal in life, in the Saint Germain, life is education. We learn and we grow, and it's so important for me, I'm just grateful for both of these teachings. Um, at the time going through my addictions, which we can elaborate a little bit, in a little bit, I didn't understand how pivotal of a point these teachings played in my life, but they played a huge, pivotal point in my life to get me through this journey. And once I found the gospel of Jesus Christ, I was ready and I was prepared. And um, so I'm very, very grateful for both of these teachings. And then the Ramtha School, it says, consciousness and energy create the nature of reality. So we have the power to create joy and happiness into our lives. We have the power to create and manifest anything that we want to do, move mountains, and so these things are some pretty pivotal teachings that I had.
Yeah. So you had these teachings, not the ideal upbringing. Mom and dad were divorced.
Yeah.
And in your teenage years, you really started to struggle.
Yeah, and so, I grew up playing sports, and, I remember when I was a young kid, one of my friend's brothers was addicted to meth, and I was like, it's like, dude, I can't believe your brother, he's addicted to meth, that's crazy, and sure enough, at 13 and 14, I'm smoking cigarettes and drinking, smoking weed, and 14, 15, started dabbling in cocaine, and next thing you know, from 17 to 33 years old, I'm addicted to methamphetamines, and
What was that like for you?
it was it was hard, I experienced some, pretty traumatic, for me, it was pretty traumatic experiences when I was younger, and what I realized is, when I would use meth, it just helped dull the pain, and then, at, I would say 18 years old, maybe 19, I'm not sure of the years, I was heavily influenced by, I met, this Mexican guy, and, I really looked up to him, and, next thing I know, I'm selling drugs for this Mexican guy, and I just thought it was just uh, some country Mexican guy with, his family, and it was three brothers and his mom and everybody, and, I just thought it was some country Mexicans, and I didn't realize it was a cartel until after the fact, and, so I was heavily influenced by, um, the Mexican cartel, and, they had the taco truck, they had the uncles coming up from Mexico bringing the drugs and hearing about coyotes, and them making trips to Mexico every year in December, and but I was just living the fast life. It was just about, I just wanted to get the drugs, go out with women, lust, pornography, go to the casino, and that's just kind of how my life went, and that's how I lived my life. I lived in the moment. I never was thinking about anything other than living in the moment.
Did you, I mean, I'm sure in the beginning that all seemed exciting, but did it turn on you? Did it get to a point where you're just like, I hate this, but I can't stop?
The time I was with, selling drugs for the Mexicans, well, I had some experiences, and so I ran with them for about 10 years selling drugs, and what happened at the end, and I made mistakes, with the family, but one thing I never did was I never stole, and I was, like, whenever I made a mistake, I took accountability for it, and towards the end, one of the brothers blamed me for kilos of heroin and meth getting stolen, and then, that's when I realized, oh my goodness, I'm just the fall guy. I looked at these people like my family, and they weren't my family. And it's so easy to have, be manipulated, and especially at a young age, by a group of people. And that experience, I remember one time before I got blamed for the drugs, things started kind of falling apart, and I'm kinda they kinda distanced themselves from me, and, I always had a vehicle to drive, and next thing you know, they took the vehicle away from me, and I just remember one night, I'm going through it, going through these trials and tribulations, and
It's scary.
oh my
You got a
goodness.
whole group of people that have a lot of power, they have money, they have drugs,
Yeah,
and you're just the little guy, and they get to kind of run things how they want.
and during the time, I was experiencing, like, between the cartels and then the gangs afterwards. I was experiencing a lot of gang stalking, like I thought I was going crazy, and it was like a coordinated effort. And I just remember being really scared. And I remember one night going to one of the brothers' houses because there's 3 brothers in the family. And I remember going to his house, knocking on the door, no one opened the door, and I curled up on a ball and cried, that night. And then the next morning he woke up, came outside, and he's like, "What are you doing?" And I just was like so distraught, just broken, and like I said, I consider these guys my family. He's like, "Come with me." And so I get in the car with him, and he goes and he gives me $20 and drops me off at the gas station.
Mm.
And I was just broken, and then, at the same time is when, I got blamed for all these drugs getting stolen, and I never did it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm living in fear, and then I'm being targeted, and it was just talk about a psychological warfare, and then so then I'm living in fear, and there's so much corruption. I'm from a liberal city, Olympia, Washington, right outside of Seattle, and you have the
the cartel and the cops, and
yeah,
they're all working together, deciding who's going to take the fall.
Yeah, the cartels, the corrupt police, the corrupt, government officials, everybody's working together. And I did not realize that at the time, and so when I had this falling out with the cartel, I started growing weed, and then, what I did is I surrounded myself with gangsters, and I never became a gang member, but I'm growing pounds and pounds of weed. And of course, I'm feeling accepted, but the same games and the same, it was just like a revolving door,
right?
And there's a lot of good people, but after those experiences of the 10 years around the Mexicans, cartels, and then the 10 years around the gangs, listen, it was a learning experience. There was times where I contemplated suicide. It was a coordinated effort. And if you don't comply to that way of life, or, I remember in 2009, the police asked me to become an informant, and I said no, because I was like, there's a
code.
There's a street code, and ultimately, so I'm like, no, I'm not, if I'm in trouble, you guys got me. I'll go do my time. And I went and did my time. And sure enough, after the fact, I realized, oh my goodness, these people don't care about you. It's this whole code. Everybody's working with the police or working with the cartels, and they just control the streets and everything that's going on in the streets, And so those were pivotal points, and I learned a lot. But going back to the teachings that I had as a kid, especially in the Ramtha school, it was like having blinders on the whole time. I didn't know what was going on.
And you were weak. I mean, you've got pornography, you've got lust, you've got drugs, and all these tricks of the world that make you feel important and powerful.
Yeah.
They really weaken you.
Absolutely. And then the last couple years before I went to prison in 2017 is when I really hit rock bottom, experiencing homelessness and riding the bus to stay warm and walking the streets. And my goodness, being targeted, gang stalked. I didn't understand what was going on. And all I can say now, more will be revealed as time goes on. Everything's in the Lord's perfect timing, so I will reveal more. But I just know that I've been targeted since I was a young child, and we're all targeted. Whether it's drugs, whether, like we come to earth and we come to learn. And whether it's drugs, pornography, gambling, all those are Satan's tactics to take away our moral compass and to have control over our lives.
Right.
And so for me, the last couple of years before I went to prison in 2017, I really hit rock bottom. But the Lord was calling me, and I had to understand that I had to see the homelessness. I had to really go through it to be able to have the compassion that I have for people now. So when I went to prison in 2017, it was like I was warm. I remember it was December, and I was just ready to just go and I went and turned myself in, and I got sentenced to like 14 months. So I had to do like 9 or 10 months or something like that, and so
you were ready.
I was ready, but so as soon as I got to prison, I went to a church service. It wasn't LDS, and that's when I read the King James Bible. And then I was walking to my cell, and my next door cellmate asked me if I wanted to read the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price. And I've shared this story a lot, about my conversion and reading about Alma the Young and the sons of Mosiah living in sin and iniquity, being visited by an angel of the Lord, and them repenting of their sins and becoming an instrument. And that just gave me inspiration that I could change my life. But we were talking last night during that time is when I realized, oh my goodness, the adversaries had complete control over my life, not just with my meth addiction, but with my lust, my gambling, pornography, all these different addictions. That's how the adversary had complete control over my life, and it dictated my joy and happiness,
Mhm.
and my in my darkness and misery,
Right.
you know. And so,
I think in a way going to prison, it's like it separates you
oh my
and all of a
goodness,
sudden you have a clearer vision. And
yes,
so I was really grateful for that because I was like, oh, I've been tricked.
yep,
I was out there in the world thinking that money and success and all that mattered. And when all of it's gone, I could see that I had given all my power away
yep,
in these addictions.
yep. So going to prison for me was a blessing in disguise.
Mhm.
Why? Because I was sober minded. Being sober minded played such a huge part because when I read the scriptures, it resonated with me,
Mhm.
And for me, of course, the story of Alma the Young and the Sons of Mosiah. But when I'm reading about the Gadiaton robbers and the secret sorceries and all the corruption and iniquity and the secret bands, that come together, I'd experienced that in the streets,
Mhm.
and I knew that this was just history repeating itself.
Yeah.
And so, I was just given inspiration. It planted a seed in my heart, and I just started nourishing that seed, each and every single day by reading a chapter in the morning and a chapter in the evening. And it's something that I continue to do to do to this day. And
You made a commit. I mean, from the time that you went to prison, you made a commitment and you have not looked back. You've been committed to not only have you been sober,
yeah,
no sex, no masturbation, no pornography, no nothing. Like one thing I really admire about you is you are all in
yeah,
and you understand where your power comes at this point.
yeah,
And so from that point on, you haven't looked back. And that's really amazing.
yeah. It's huge, And so after I got out of prison, I got out in 2018, joined the church in 2019. And then went to BYU Idaho in 2021 to the end of 2023. And so, getting out of prison, you get out of prison and
You got nothing.
nothing. I'm riding the bus. I'm living in a clean and sober house, and I had to take all the small little steps. Started going to church and the addiction recovery program meeting, and I'm really grateful for that program because when I got out of prison and started attending, I remember going to this meeting with doctors and lawyers and dentists and police officers, and here I am out of prison, and that's when I realized that no matter what walk of life we come from, we all have something in common, and that's Jesus Christ. And everybody showed me so much love and kindness. And next thing you know, members of the church are taking me to church and picking me up and inviting me over for Thanksgiving. And, next thing I'm developing these relationships and I'm getting to see families, a man and a woman with their children and their grandparents. And, they have their struggles and stuff, but it's something that I never saw before because I didn't experience it. And so it really attracted me. And I knew that I had nothing to offer these people.
Mhm. It's not like in the streets where you're selling drugs for them. They're like, we just love you and want to see you improve your life,
Yes,
right?
and everybody just showed me so much love, and it was an experience that I never. This is what I was looking for,
Mhm.
and it was
It was
it
real.
was sincere,
Right.
and so when I got out of prison, listen, this everything I'd experienced in the streets, it was walking through the trenches. It was walking through the valley of the shadow of death.
Yeah.
So confused, and so when I came to the church, it was like, this is a whole new experience.
Yeah.
And I was able to, it was small baby steps, like I said, and then I got a car and a better job. I remember the church gave me a job working for his construction company, and I just went into those interviews and just told him about my past, and what I'm doing. And he gave me a job and that was huge for me, and so I started working in the sheet metal industry and that just prepared me. I worked there from 2019 to 2020 and then went to school at BYU Idaho in 2021. So
Mhm.
I majored in construction management. And what was huge for me being at BYU Idaho is I finally got to be the big brother to those around me, a positive influence, but it was huge in my recovery because it took me away from Washington.
Mhm.
I have the temple there. BYU Idaho is, for those that are watching, it's a church school, surrounded by the gospel of Jesus Christ, and so to be able to go to class, learn my trade, but to be able to invite the Spirit in by, you know, um, a prayer or a spiritual thought every class, that really meant a lot to me. And then I started sharing my story and took a public speaking class and, just started learning and growing. And so being at BYU Idaho from all of 21, 22, and 23 was huge in my recovery and really prepared me for really going out into the world these last couple years since graduation, you know. And so I'm grateful for BYU Idaho. I'm grateful for everything I was able to learn and to grow, and it just strengthened me. And by the time I left BYU Idaho, I had 5 years of sobriety,
Wow.
a degree,
Mm-hmm.
and I got a good job, moved to Arizona. I was able to buy a house right away. You know, that I'm hitting these
Milestones.
you know, and during that time, in the end of 2023, I tried to rush a marriage over like a 3 or 4 month period, you know, and it was a great learning experience. She's a lovely lady, but it just wasn't a good fit. And what I realized is you cannot rush the process, you know.
Mhm.
So I started checking these boxes, you know, it's clean and sober, graduated, bought a house, you know, and
And these are all things that probably when you were in the street seemed so hard to get.
oh, it wasn't even a reality. It was more, that was a fairy tale, you know. I
Yeah.
was never going to be able to buy a house or, you know, be able to
Have a job that,
you know, a
yeah,
good paying
go to
job.
college, all
Yeah,
those
yeah, I
things.
never thought about that, you know, and but it's just been, you know, small little baby steps, you know, and so that was a good experience for me, you know. So I almost got married and realized that, you know what, that's not the time, you know, and the job that I had really wasn't a good fit, the company I was with. So I was able to find a new construction company, and I'm a traveling construction manager now, and pretty much, you know, I was able to go out to North Carolina and work out there for 10 months, and now I'm in Minneapolis, and I'll be out here until the end of 2026.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I really love construction. I really love to be able to problem solve and work with people and contractors. You know, everybody's from all different walks of life, you know. And what's interesting is I really love to develop a relationship with, you know, a superintendent out there, a subcontractor, and I don't share my past with them, but they get to see who I am, how my character is, how I hold myself. You know, I don't use profanity. You know, I don't drink. You know, I don't do a lot of things that people do in construction. You know, and then a couple months will go down the road, and I'll tell them about my past, and they're like, "What? You're a Mormon? What the heck?" You know. But you know, I just live my life. You know, I lead by example, and I've just been given a lot of strength, and now I'm really starting to see, you know, the fruits of the teachings that I had as a kid, and you combine that with the gospel of Jesus Christ, it's like, man, you know, I really see the big picture, and I've been through the trenches,
Yeah, you have.
the cartels, the drugs.
I would say, because I know you, you've become really passionate about politics and this war on drugs because you know what it did to you and how easy it is to influence young people.
Yeah,
And you recognize, like, we've really got to eliminate drugs, or we've got to make a big effort here to not make it so acceptable. And also because you've seen the corruption.
yeah,
So when you see things that are going on and some of the fraud and other things, you're like, oh my gosh,
yeah.
this is stuff that was going on in the, and you're passionate about it.
Yeah, so for me, I'm a proud Christian conservative, you know, and there's a lot happening in the world right now, you know, and I'm so grateful for this administration, for Donald Trump, and everything that he's doing to make America great and to really heal the nation.
Mhm.
You've got to stop the drugs coming in, and you know, I texted you this morning when I was at the gym. It was pretty cool because we finally got Nicolas Maduro, who was the Venezuelan dictator, drug lord,
Mhm.
and next is going after the cartels, you
Mhm.
know, in Mexico. And we've got to stop the drugs coming into the United States. The old system, you know, because when you have cartels working together with corrupt
Politicians.
politicians using taxpayer money to fund all this stuff, and the fraud that's coming, you know, happening from it. I'm in Minneapolis and watching the fraud that's going on in Minneapolis. This is crazy, and that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
And so I've been able to spend a lot of time on YouTube and watching a lot of, you know, seeing what's happening in politics, and it really
It's personal to you.
it's personal because I've experienced it, you know. And you know, we've got to stop the drugs coming in the United States. You know, we've got to stop men and women's sports. We've got to stop the illegal immigration, you know, in the United States, which this administration has done, you know, as soon as Donald Trump got in office. And there's got to be a legal, not illegal, but a legal way for immigrants to come in if they want to come and contribute to this Christian nation.
Mhm.
You know, this nation was built on Christian values, and that's what our founding fathers did. It was built on Christian values, and that's what separates us from a lot of other nations. We have the freedom to speak, we have the freedom to live, and we have the freedom to do what we want to do. It's a free nation.
But we lose our power when we don't live correct principles.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. You know, and so I'm just so
I know you're passionate, man.
I'm passionate, and you know, I see myself in the next 5 or 10 years
You
going to Washington. I see myself in the political arena. You know, I'm an advocate for
want to see people leave prison and get jobs
yeah, you know, so the huge thing is I can use my story to inspire others that they can change.
Mhm.
They can change their life. They can be successful. I have a successful job, a successful career, and I've been in the trenches, you know, and I went and got a degree and got an education and have a great job. I want people to know that. I want people to know that they can overcome, whether it's drugs, lust, pornography, gambling,
All of it.
all of it. You can overcome all of it.
Mhm.
You know, and the joy and happiness that I have in my life is just so profound because I want everybody to have it, and I know that they can.
Yeah.
And I know that my story is going to be able to reach millions and millions and millions and millions of people.
Mhm.
So I see myself being a huge advocate for prison reentry and rehabilitation. And, you know, I know that the Lord is going to open up opportunities. You know, it's one of those things, consciousness and energy create the nature of reality.
Yeah.
I see myself in Washington. I see myself making a stand on really helping people. I'm just so grateful, like I said, for Donald Trump, the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, AG, Pam Bondi, Kash Patel, the FBI director. Like, they are not playing around, you know, and this is all in preparation. You know, Donald Trump is gathering nations
Mhm.
together and creating lasting life, relationships with these nations. And, you know, I really believe that the second coming of Jesus Christ is knocking at the door. I believe that the second coming of Jesus Christ is going to happen in 2026,
Mm.
this year.
I hope you're right.
You know, and you know, I'm reading out of Leviticus right now, and I'm reading about Jubilee, and every 50 years in the book of Leviticus, I'll read it. The biblical year of Jubilee, according to the book of Leviticus in the Hebrew Bible, the year of Jubilee was sacred for the Israelites. That was supposed to occur every 50 years. It was a time of universal redemption and restoration that included specific mandates. Debt forgiveness, all debts were to be canceled. Release of enslaved people. All Hebrew people enslaved due to debt were set free and returned to their families. But look at it like this: release of all enslaved people that are addicted to drugs.
Yeah.
You know, and what's Donald Trump doing? He's stopping the drugs from coming into the United States.
Mm.
You know, and so it just resonates with me because what he's doing is right.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to be on, there's two sides to be on. You're either going to be on the right side of history or the wrong side of history. And what's happening right now and the change that's happening in America is the right side of history. And this is what the founding fathers envisioned America to become, you know? And then the last thing is the restoration of land. All land that has been sold or leased was returned to its original or ancestral owners, ensuring that property remained within families and preventing permanent concentration of wealth. And so the United States 250th anniversary, which will be July 4th of 2026,
Mm-hmm.
was known as the America 250. We'll be celebrating July 4th of 2026. This is exactly 50-year cycle since the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. Some religious interpretations view this 250-year, 5 times 50 milestone as a significant time for reflection on the nation's founding principles of liberty and potentially a spiritual fresh start in a biblical sense of Jubilee year, focusing on things like calling for a return of national ideas, inspiring modern discussions about debt relief, social justice, and economic equality, and proclaiming liberty throughout all the land and its inhabitants. A phrase from Leviticus 25:10b is famously inscribed on the Liberty Bell. I'm ecstatic about life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've been able to change my life through the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm so grateful to live a life of sobriety, live the law of chastity, and, you know, to stand firm and confident in what I'm talking about and what I believe in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and now more than ever, listen, if you're walking in sin and iniquity, it's never too late to change. That's what the gospel of Jesus Christ is all about, is making change and recognizing and taking accountability for your actions. But that's the thing, is you have to take accountability for your actions to be able to move forward in the truth.
Would you ever give up the power and joy that you have now we've talked about this, like you've dated girls that are like, oh, we can mess around. You're like, oh no, that is a trick. That is, I'll never give up what I have now for something So foolish is momentary pleasure.
Yeah, I'll never give up what I have now. The joy and happiness and the foresight that I see,
Mhm.
I'm gonna create what I'm creating in my life is what I was put on this planet to do. The light that I have, I want to share with everybody because I know that they can change their lives. The thing about it is when you're living in the addictions that I lived in, a lot of people you can't see the other side.
Right.
It's two different worlds. Well, guess what? I'm the one who can connect both those worlds. If I can be where you've been in the
Mhm.
trenches and I've been able to change my life through the gospel of Jesus Christ, come try. Come
Mhm.
follow me.
Mhm.
I mean, this is real, and so I'm so grateful and blessed to be here with you on this, New Year's and today I'm going to be going into the Utah State Prison and sharing the gospel in the Utah State Prison and to be able to be an inspiration to the men in there and just to be the inspiration to the people around me is just so remarkable. I love this gospel. I love the man that I've become. And I love being able to speak my truth and to have courage and to see that the rest of the nation is doing the same thing, And so I'm so grateful that you have this podcast. And this is going to be huge because it's going to give people the opportunity to speak their truth. And it's so amazing, And one thing I do love, and I just want to just touch on a little bit before we're done, is I'm so grateful for you and Chad.
Mhm.
I love to see how you guys have just made it through the trenches, and and everything that you've went through, and you guys have stuck it out with one another, and you guys love one another. And so, if you could just share a little bit about your
Yeah.
story before we're done, that'd be
Yeah,
great.
I feel like I feel that same feeling like we're called to I have a purpose on this earth and I feel truly blessed because I was a young single mother, placed a child for adoption, addicted to drugs. I feel like Chad and I are this eternal, we made a deal before we came to earth, right? Chad's background was a lot different than mine. He had served a mission and had just graduated college. And I don't know how I tricked him into marrying me, but got married. And I do know I had learned at that point that God could do something for me I couldn't do for myself. Like I got sober and we went to the temple and we started this family.
Yeah.
And I ended up relapsing on prescription drugs because doesn't matter if it's methamphetamine or if it's Adderall for me, like I'm an addict and my judgment is poor. And I became very tricked by the world and the money of the world and was involved in some of that corruption. A lot of bigger players that walked away and I ended up sentenced to 7 years in prison. And I remember the day that I was sentenced and Chad stood up and he advocated for me. He said, please don't send her to prison without give her time to say goodbye to her family. And that's the day I felt the power of my covenant. Even though I'd made these mistakes, I felt the power of the gospel and the covenants that Chad and I had made in our marriage. And I knew we would get through it together. And I experienced leaving my children and my family and a lot of pain and
Mm.
also a very refining experience of coming to know who I am and our Savior. I used to fast every single Sunday when I was in prison. I lived temple worthy every day of my prison sentence. And I knew that I was worth the wait, and Chad waited, and our marriage grew even in that difficult experience of being separated. And I'll have people say, "Oh, there's no way your husband was faithful to you," or yeah, you were masturbating. And I'm like, none of that happened.
Yeah.
None of it, because we needed power in our life. We needed to do it together.
Hmm.
And there is something so much deeper than those worldly things, right? In marriage or just in life in general. And I would never sacrifice something as real and true as an eternal relationship for some momentary pleasure. And so we were faithful to each other, and I think our children have benefited from us keeping our covenants.
Hmm.
And I've been home now for 6 years. And yeah, it's pretty cool that it's interesting. I was working at a drug treatment center, and one of the girls said, "Why does Chad love you so much? And are you a good wife to him?" And I said, "Probably not that good of a wife. Like he's more on Team Portia. I said, I should do better." She said, "Why does he love you so much?" And I said, "Because Chad loves who I am to the world.
Yeah.
And I believe that he loves that I have a purpose on this earth, and he is so supportive of that. And I think that that's what we all deserve. And I know that that's what you're waiting for. You're like, I'm
Yes.
not going to take a relationship that isn't lined up with my purpose on
Yep.
this earth."
And I've really been thinking about that too, Portia. I know that the Lord's got the 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 right woman for me. It's going to take a very unique individual,
Right.
especially with the things that I've been through. But I know that the Lord has brought me this far. I don't need to rush into anything and just let everything happen in the Lord's timing. And I know I'll be able to have a family. I'll be able to have kids, and I'll be a faithful husband. And I just know in my heart that everything that I've went through was for a purpose. And I just know that with our stories, we're going to be able to help change the world. I know that this old system is getting ready to collapse.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have a foundation. There's no truth behind it.
Right.
All the fraud, the gangs, the drugs, everything, the dishonesty, everything has no foundation.
Right.
It's going to collapse. And we are going to be the ones to help build up a foundation in truth and righteousness and in liberty and be able to help those and show others that, listen, they can change their lives
Mm-hmm.
and they can live a certain way and be able to find joy and happiness, because the joy and happiness that I have in my life
Mm-hmm.
outweighs the misery and pain that I went through, And one thing with Saint Germain, it focuses on, like, it's called alchemy. It's turning base metals into gold in a physical sense, but on a spiritual sense, it's turning darkness, sin, and iniquity, transforming into light, joy, and happiness. And that's what the gospel has done in my life. And I just know it can happen for anybody. So.
Yeah, you're a really good example of, I've seen pictures of you in the thick of your addiction. It's like the light and goodness that God has brought into your life, and what you represent is powerful, and it will change the world.
Yep.
So thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's so fun when you come into town and we get to visit, but thank you for joining us today on the Living Louder podcast. Next time Michael's in town, we'll have to do it again.
Yes, absolutely.
More to come. You guys, we love you and appreciate you following along.
Yep.
So.